Hi everyone, this week we celebrate our 500th episode. Thank you for being with us. Those of you who support us on Patreon can already listen to a special episode we've recorded to mark the occasion. The episode is about the life of Ukrainians abroad. If you haven't subscribed to our Patreon, you can do so by following the link in the description to this episode. This way you can also support our podcast. My name is Artem, and here is the news. 482 days less the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In his evening video address, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky informed that yesterday in Kherson, rescuers were injured as a result of the Russian shelling. They were relieving the consequences of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant destruction. 8 state emergency service workers were injured, 1 unfortunately was killed. Zelensky expressed his condolences to their families and friends and promised that Ukrainian warriors will definitely give the terrorists a response to all this meanness. The European Commission proposes to allocate 50 billion euros of financial assistance to Ukraine in the form of grants and loans, reports Liga. According to the EU document, it is suggested to allocate these funds in 2024-2027. The aim is to help Ukraine in its comprehensive reform in order to achieve the standards necessary for joining the EU. At the same time, it is emphasized that a reliable system of transparency, audit, and control to ensure the protection of the financial interests of the EU will be introduced for the allocated aid. U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Military and Political Affairs Stanley Brown believes that the potential transfer of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, either from the United States or from allies, will take months, reports European Pravda. According to him, although the US has not yet announced its intention to transfer fighter jets to Ukraine, it supports such plans on the part of its allies. Brown emphasized that the process of transferring modern aircraft to Ukraine should be holistic and include training of both pilots and technicians. Then it will be necessary to determine how the transfer of fighters to Ukraine will take place. Brown said the State Department is already working on paperwork for transfer requests from third countries. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu threatened to launch strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine if the armed forces of Ukraine conduct strikes against occupied Crimea, reports Radio Liberty. According to him, Ukrainian commanders plan to strike the Russian territory, including Crimea, with HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles. Shoigu said that the occupied Ukrainian peninsula is outside the war zone, so the Russian military leadership will consider possible strikes on Crimea as drawing the US and the UK into the war, and will strike back at the decision-making centers in Ukraine. Shoigu also complained that since June 4th, the armed forces of Ukraine had carried out 263 attacks on the positions of the Russian troops. We would really appreciate if you could rate us, ideally with 5 stars, and leave a glowing review in the apps where you are listening to this podcast: Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or others. This really helps more people to find the highlights from Ukraine and learn the truth about Russia's invasion. Spread the word, people, spread the word. Commenting on the course of counteroffensive operations in Ukraine, the Pentagon believes that the Ukrainian forces have the necessary assets for their actions to be successful, reports European Pravda. According to Pentagon spokesperson Sabrina Singh, hostilities in Ukraine are turning into protracted battles every day, as was the case in Bakhmut. But Ukrainians have combat power and the ability to succeed in counteroffensive operations. She also informed that the Pentagon audit of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine has revealed a $6.2 billion discrepancy between the estimated and actual cost of the equipment provided. Singh said that the accounting error arose because Pentagon services used the replacement cost of equipment rather than the net book value, thereby overestimating the value of the equipment drawn down from U.S. stocks and provided to Ukraine. The reassessment of military aid to Ukraine could mean that the United States has more extra funds than previously thought, which means it may not be necessary for the White House and Congress to agree on another financial assistance package for Ukraine just yet. State defense concern of Ukraine Ukroboronprom informed about successful use of a Ukraine-produced drone with a 1,000 kilometers range, reports NVUA. It released a photo of Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, Commander of the Air Force Mykola Oleshchuk, and Director of Ukroboronprom Yuri Gusev, captioned "After successful use of our 1,000 kilometers range drone." According to Ukrainska Pravda sources, the drone was effectively used on 3rd of May. Reportedly that day, in the village of Volna in Krasnodar Krai in Russia, not far from the Crimean Bridge, an oil depot caught fire. Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Oleksiy Danilov, said that one of the current priorities of the defense forces of Ukraine is weakening the artillery of the Russian occupying forces on the front lines, reports Interfax Ukraine. He stressed that Ukrainian troops are achieving the goals set by the top command step by step, having saved the lives of soldiers and civilians as one of their main priorities. Danilov explains that the defense forces of Ukraine are simultaneously conducting both offensive and defensive actions. He stressed that Putin's political objectives of destroying Ukraine by military means have not changed and they remain on the Kremlin agenda. This task will be pivotal until Russia suffers military defeat followed by internal destabilization and overthrow of Putin's regime. Thank you for listening to the Highlights from Ukraine podcast. We're a commercial initiative of just two people and we need your help to grow. Share information about the podcast, rate us in the app, subscribe to our Patreon. With your support, we're getting better. We call on you to demand from governments of your countries to impose the toughest sanctions possible on Russia and its citizens to stop their invasion of Ukraine.